Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Ooh, he's got a Prussia video. Kill. How did the Prussian army dominate Europe in the 1800s? Let's find out, gang. Go. Play. Play.
This brings us to the sponsor of today's video,
Or bring me 3 minutes in.
I'm excited to announce that the first gameplay trailer for our new game, Fire and Maneuver, has been released, and you can check it out right now on Steam using the link in the description. Fire and Maneuver is a historical strategy game set during the years 1853 to 1871.
My boys, Otto, Napoleon #3.
And utilizes a simultaneous turn-based system. We will also have a campaign system, historical battles, and a map editor that will be showing off on our development channel, Armchair History Interactive. Our game will be released in early access on Steam for free on June 15th, so don't forget to wishlist. If you want to support development and play the alpha build right now, subscribe on Patreon and join our Discord, which is also linked below. She can almost...
Okay, guys, so, Prussia. Clearly there was a moment. So, say Napoleon doesn't exist, okay, gang? Let's just get in the mindset. Say Napoleon never exists. Say the French Revolution never happens, okay? So, Louis the 16th. So, the French Revolution never happens. So, clearly they are the greatest army in Europe, regardless of Napoleon or not, right? Because they're able to take on the other great powers of Europe and eventually be defeated and the monarchy reinstated. But so clearly, Prussia between between Frederick the Great and Otto von Bismarck is a period where they are not dominant. I don't know what I'm trying to say. Something that I'm not able to. Clearly, Prussia is not the dominant force in Europe. In the early 1800s, something happens.
Almost hear the words in her beloved's voice. Marie von Clausewitz sorts through her late husband's papers, a seemingly bottomless well of military musings and observations. In these pages is written the theory of Karl von Clausewitz, the man whose book would lead the charge to turn Prussia from a military failure shamed by Napoleon into the military leader of Europe. As she reads her husband's words, it's as if Marie is on the battlefield at Auerstedt, the Prussian cavalry breaking around her as Napoleon's squares put them to rout. She feels the sting of defeat marching in the loping retreat, the horse bearing the now eyeless and mortally wounded Duke of Brunswick passing. Marie will live to publish her beloved's treatise on the art of war, but not to see its effect. The Grand Army of Prussia crushing the stagnant French, and the proclamation of a new German Empire in the very seat of French vanity. Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian.
Hello.
Voltaire once quipped that while many states have an army, the Prussian Royal Army had a state. Though thoroughly cliched by now, Voltaire's words are strikingly true. Military service and...
So he was... I mean, he died in 1778. Alright, so clearly... the Prussians are a big deal in the 1700s, but
philosophy were key pillars of Prussian society and helped this small militaristic kingdom become the force that would create a united Germany, and whose descendants would plunge the world into conflicts of titanic proportions. In today's video, we will chronicle what we believe are the twin historical times that made the Prussian army the military juggernaut history buffs know, and in some cases, love. From the embarrassments at the hands of Napoleon to the jubilation at Versailles, this is a concise overview of the evolution of the Prussian army. One of the key factors that allowed the Prussian army to win wars was military intelligence. In the Franco-Prussian War, many Prussian officers had toured France in their youth, memorizing the terrain and fortifications. This brings us to the sponsor of today's video, NordVPN, which allows you to conduct your own missions into foreign territory
Make sure to use the /history VPN, guys.
With features like dynamic region switching using over 5,000 servers in 60 different countries. NordVPN remains the only strong, reliable VPN that lets you access region-locked historical content alongside shows, movies, and documentaries from all across the world. On top of that, NordVPN comes with a host of extra tools like NordLocker, an encrypted cloud storage system, and NordPass for password security. Start building your intel report today with NordVPN and support our channel in the process by signing up using the link in the description below. The fire that would forge the modern Prussian army was first kindled during the Napoleonic Wars, when Prussia stood alongside the rest of the Fourth Coalition as they made their attempt to strike down the would-be tyrant of Europe, once and for all. But the Prussian steel, initially forged by the military genius of Frederick the Great, had
Blücher, right? Blücher? He was the Prussian general. I think there's a biographics video on him.
Grown brittle and rusty over the years, leaving the nation fielding a force as disorganized as it was toothless. The Royal Army had become a haven for social climbers seeking to use military service to advance their own careers, and these politically minded officers rode the coattails of their forebearers, lazily implementing tried strategies that were highly predictable. Petty bureaucracy and rivalries between these complacent officers exacerbated the Royal Army's issues. The net result of all of this was a force whose rank-and-file soldiers were disciplined and proud to serve, but whose movements were ponderous and predictable. Von Clausewitz likened the Royal Army to a damaged building. Behind the facade, all was mildewed. Jena Auerstedt saw the French outmaneuver the mildewed Prussians, particularly at Auerstedt. At this fight, 52,000 Prussians attacked an invading French army half their size. But the Prussian officers lived up to their reputation, evincing an utter lack of coordination and failing to press their numerical advantage during their initial engagements, letting Napoleon's army launch a bold counteroffensive. The Imperial French routed their Germanic foes, pursuing the Prussians all the way to Berlin. Their capital occupied, the Prussians put on a brave but ultimately futile resistance, with the rest of the kingdom falling to the French in less than a month. This shameful display was witnessed by the men whose names would be written on the pages of military history. The aforementioned von Clausewitz, future officer corps reformer Gerhard von Scharnhorst, organizational mastermind August von Gneisenau, and future Waterloo victor Gebert von Blücher. This cadre witnessed the embarrassment of their kingdom's military and would go on to play key roles in Prussia's reclaiming of her military honor. But before Prussia could rise, she had to fall. Napoleon dragged Prussia to the negotiating table and foisted the Peace of Tilsit on them in 1807, hobbling its armed forces and seizing large portions of Prussian territory. King Frederick Wilhelm III, determined to not let this happen to his kingdom ever again, assembled the Military Reform Commission not long thereafter. Their purpose was simple: find what went wrong in the fight against Napoleon and correct it with vigor. Von Scharnhorst and von Gneisenau would lead the commission, ably assisted by von Clausewitz, who would later use his notes from their meetings as the basis for On War. The commission's main reforms were ending corporal punishment in the ranks, introducing combined arms tactics, and advocating for mass conscription. Von Scharnhorst used his part to introduce meritocracy into the Prussian officer corps, opening it up to candidates outside of the aristocracy and advocating for an officer's qualifications to be, in peace, knowledge and education, in times of war, courage and conduct. For the next 6 years, Napoleon would campaign and conquer, while Prussia reformed. Martial training was deeply embedded into general education, and while the questionably qualified officers proved difficult to sack, Scharnhorst's push for more recruiting gave the kingdom's nepotistic and self-aggrandizing generals a competent group of assistants at the very least. By 1813, King Frederick Wilhelm III had a much improved force at his disposal, and the will to use it. Napoleon's devastating defeat in Russia gave Frederick his opening, and as France licked its frostbitten wounds, Prussia...
Why can't you guys just keep it simple and go Wilhelm I, Wilhelm II, Wilhelm III, Wilhelm IV, repeat, rinse and repeat? Somehow Wilhelm III is now, and Wilhelm II is leading up to World War I. It's confusing.
In Russia gave Frederick his opening, and as France licked... Napoleon's devastating defeat in Russia gave Frederick his opening, and as France licked its frostbitten wounds, Prussia moved in on the injured empire. In what would become known as the War of Liberation, Prussia marshaled a full 6% of its population to reclaim its territory and its honor. Though improved, the Royal Army still had some travails facing Napoleon's forces, but the 6th Coalition succeeded where the other 5 had failed, and Napoleon was removed from power. With the fall of the French Empire, Prussia joined the other victorious allies in re-establishing control of the continent, and stood poised to implement its most ambitious reforms yet. September 3, 1814 saw a tectonic shift in Prussian society. Frederick introduced conscription for all Prussian males over age 20. 3 forces made up the new military apparatus: the main standing army, the militia, and the reserves, with the entire adult male population of Prussia distributed among them. One way or another, a Prussian man served. It was this conscription force that joined the Duke of Wellington in defeating Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815. Led by von Blücher, the Prussians were instrumental in defeating and pursuing Napoleon's forces, launching a fantastically successful attack on the would-be
Grouchy, you idiot.
Emperor's right. Prussia once again sat at the victor's table and witnessed the creation of the German Confederation, which would be replaced in time by a united Germany under the Prussian banner.
Otto, get in here. Von Moltke.
The roughly 30 years following Frederick Wilhelm III's Grand Reform saw a number of key events that reshaped the face of war in Europe. New weapons, like the breech-loading rifle and rifled cannon, were introduced. Sanitation was brought to the forefront due to the horrors of the Crimean War, and telegraphs gave the world near-instant long-distance communication for the first time in history. As the world evolved at an unprecedented rate, so too did Prussia. Educational rigor became a focus of the army's development, with examinations for entrance into the officer corps introduced in 1844. Interestingly, for a society as seemingly militarized as Prussia's, there was a gradual disfavor of an entirely military education. Examinations for promotion and entrance would require not only entirely military education. Examinations for promotion and entrance would require not only the demonstration of military knowledge, but a keen general knowledge as well. The focus on education extended to all levels of the military, even the common soldiers. Unlike most other European counterparts, just about every single man in the Prussian army could read and write. This seemingly...
I can't write cursive to this day. I remember learning it, starting to learn it in like 4th grade. And 4th grade was like the big leagues after 3rd grade, leaving the 3rd grade school. You know, you have kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade in one building, and then you go to the next building for 4th and 5th grade in town, and then you go to the middle school for 6th to 8th, and then the high school for 9th to 12th. And I remember, oh, you're gonna have to know it. Well, wrong. I still don't know cursive to this day, and I haven't had to use it.
Simple addition had dramatic and far-reaching implications. Now men could be taught advanced concepts using books and training manuals that could be studied while off-duty and even during civilian life. This also radically improved battlefield cohesion and strengthened lines of communication between units. Never again would a lucky shot paralyze a whole platoon by killing one officer who could read orders to his men. Prussia's growth was not isolated to education, however. The kingdom was an early adoptee of both the aforementioned breech loaders and rifled cannons, in the form of the Dresa needle gun and the infamous Krupp gun. The Dresa was a
I want to know who was instrumental in engineering the breech load rifle, because man,
breech-loading weapon that relied on a pre-packaged paper cartridge rather than a separate shot and powder. The cartridge contained a bullet, powder, and a percussion cap, which was struck by a needle within the chamber to fire, hence needle gun. The Dresa was far easier to load than a muzzle-loaded musket thanks to its cartridge and breech system, but the all-too-essential needle was prone to damage from burning powder and the elements, as the action was not airtight.
German designers were aware of the Drace's teething issues and compensated by making the weapon extremely easy to disassemble. Broken needles could be replaced in just a few minutes, even in the middle of combat.
The main advantage of the Dresa ultimately lay in the fact that early adoption meant the army had almost 30 years of experience with a modern quick-firing infantry weapon, while the rest of Europe was still struggling to transition away from the musket. On the other hand, the revolutionary Krupp guns were a series of breech-loading field artillery pieces made of cast steel. A common example was the C-67 6-pound gun, able to accurately deposit high-explosive canister shells onto targets up to 5 miles or 8 kilometers away. This was almost twice the effective range.
I don't like editing much, but I have to include the Hauwitzen remark right here. Go. Is it over? Good? Let's go.
Of the cannons still used by most European nations. Additionally, Krupp artillery shells used some of the first contact detonators, removing the need to keep large stockpiles of timed fuses on hand for different ranges. These advantages would prove decisive in the critical war that would see the Kingdom of Prussia reforge itself into the Empire of Germany. Avid armchair viewers are doubtless familiar with the importance of the...
So I do look up to this channel. It's so great. And he's so professional and everything that I'm not. Like, he's all dressed up nice, and he's got his hair nicely, with his nice little beard and his great background and his desk and pipe. One day.
The Franco-Prussian War. Viewers are doubtless familiar with the importance of the Franco-Prussian War. This key event is the linchpin of Prussian military dominance and the climactic event of their military evolution. This was due largely to the efforts of one man, Field Marshal Helmut von Moltke. A dedicated student of von Clausewitz, Moltke oversaw a victorious revolution.
Wow, I haven't had a slap in the face like that in a long time. I was very confident. Sorry.
In the Prussian army, greater than anything Frederick William III could have dreamt of. The Prussian army that marched to war against the lesser of the two Napoleons would ride the rails of military modernization to victory.
Napoleon III is the greater of two.
As chief of the General Staff, von Moltke had laid careful preparations for this final war of German unification. He and his subordinates oversaw an expansion in Prussia's railway network purpose-built for the rapid deployment of troops. Each and every addition to the communications, Moltke remarked, especially the railroads, must be considered a military advantage. It was an advantage Prussia would need, as von Moltke knew that his army was equal to, if not smaller than, most forces on the continent. Efficiency and tactics would make the difference, since Prussia could not drown its enemies in a tide of conscripts like the Russians, or starve her foes into submission with a wooden wall.
That's the Russian flag, or the older Russian flag? I was wondering which...
Scripts like the Russians, or starve her foes into submission with a wooden wall, like the British and their navy. Von Moltke would instead focus on speed. In a grim foreshadowing of Blitzkrieg less than a century later, the objective of the Prussian army would be to overwhelm its force by lightning-fast deployment. Using railroads and telegraphs, the Prussians would attempt to swamp their enemy in the opening stages of the campaign, using the aid of the railroads to shuttle their men to the best defensive positions or get them into the most advantageous position to fall. fall upon their enemies.
I want them to make like a trading card, Pokemon style, for history's military men, and I can get myself a holographic Mulkes.
On a broader level, von Moltke pressed for a goal of encirclement, mobilizing his forces along a broad front to envelop and crush his opponent at the fastest possible pace. But von Moltke's mind was not just of metal and wheels. Ever the logistical mastermind, von Moltke posited the idea of march divided, fight united, which would see the Prussian army divide its forces for deployment, only to reorganize into a massive force to fight a decisive battle. Smaller forces proved less stressful on supply lines, and if one such subsidiary force was somehow set upon and destroyed by the enemy, the army as a whole would survive to avenge their fallen comrades. And when these smaller units coalesced and battle was joined, von Moltke knew that if their commanders hewed strictly to the letter of their orders, the battle was lost. This was the traditional way of doing battle, with the generals at the top giving specific orders and their commanders following them in the most literal sense, no matter the result. Thus, von Moltke introduced the idea of giving subordinate commanders the initiative to react to changes on the battlefield while still serving the intent of their orders.
That seems like the more I've learned that Gustavus Adolphus is like the father of modern warfare, but this is like the more recent, seems like the father of modern warfare, and Moltke being, you know, this is the separation of like grand army formations marching out into a field and the transition to a more tactical, do what you see fit while keeping the overall goal in mind, sort of modern idea of warfare we have today.
After all, as the man himself said, no plan survives contact with the enemy, and by giving commanders on the ground the ability to react in real time, von Moltke hoped to take advantage of the training and education Prussia had focused so hard on giving its officers. Like many geniuses, von Moltke's ideas were not initially well received in their time. In particular, the aforementioned empowering of junior officers, which was dubbed Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics, was seen as reckless and costly should the junior commanders falter. The simple truth was that von Moltke's ideas were anathema to the prevailing Napoleonic-era military mindset, which treated war like a chessboard, with a centralized command.
This made perfect sense for the time, as armies lived or died based on their ability to follow prearranged plans. That makes sense. But this approach became hopelessly obsolete as communications improved and mass formations became liabilities. All right, that makes complete sense. Before communication, you know, light speed communication, of course, everything is going to rely on commanders remembering the original plan and taking that and following it through no matter what happened in the battlefield, because that's simply the best way to do it, and that seems okay in the pre-communication age that they are entering in right now. I hope that makes sense.
And staff manipulating the movements of each piece down to the finest detail. Meanwhile, under the Prussian way of doing things, field commanders were granted broad authority in reacting to the shifting situation on the battlefield. If a Prussian commander saw a glaring opening to exploit a lapse in his enemy's judgment or a sudden twist of fortune, he had the ability to pursue it with vigor. A Napoleonic commander, on the other hand, would be forced to watch such opportunities slip through his fingers, with the penalty of immediate court-martial if he dared defy the centralized command structure. Thus were the Prussians able to outthink and outmaneuver their enemies.
So that does make sense, though. Like looking back in the bad communication, but as they're entering into this new communication age with more instant communication, then this becomes obsolete, and the Prussians are taking advantage.
After years of careful planning and training, the new Prussian army was finally tested in battle against the Austrians in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866.
Between 1848 and 1851, the Germans fought the Schleswig-Holstein War. Yep. With Denmark, a series of small and mostly indecisive land and naval battles that ended in a white peace. A second war occurred in 1864, ending in 8 months with a German victory. And Wilhelm, I know, wanted to march on to Vienna, and Otto was like, no.
Using 5 separate train lines, the Prussians were able to storm across the border and quickly coalesce into 3 army groups that totally outflanked their shocked Austrian adversaries. The initial engagements quickly showed the value of the Dresa needle gun, whose high rate of fire enabled the Prussians to decimate the Austrian infantry at close range. Yet at long range, Austrian muzzleloaders proved more accurate, and a lack of Krupp guns meant that the enemy artillery often outranged Moltke's own.
Interesting. How the muzzle-loaded guns were more accurate at a distance.
But at the climactic Battle of Königgrätz, the Prussians were able to decisively outmaneuver their Austrian opponents and inflict some 20,000 casualties while taking another 22,000 prisoners of war. The war ended in a total Prussian victory and served as a vital proving ground for Moltke's new stratagems.
So that was like the war to decide who is the true German leader for the future?
Giving him time to refine
the Austrians or the Prussians,
and perfect his techniques just in time for war against France, which broke out just 4 years later in 1870. With von Moltke at their head, the Prussians were able to deliver a stunning defeat to the French, ironically using one of Napoleon Bonaparte's favorite tactics against them. The Prussians' victory was secured through skillful use of modern artillery, carrying on the legacy of the first French emperor in the fight against the second.
Not bad.
Von Moltke's forces were armed with the latest in breech-loading cannon from the infamous Krupp arms factories. The climactic Battle of Sedan saw the Prussians reach the height of their artillerist powers, skillfully bombing the French into submission and securing the victory that forged the German Empire.
Who's Napoleon II, guys? I gotta...
With the victory over France, the German Empire was declared in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, and the evolution of the Prussian army was complete.
World War
From their
I
defeat
incoming.
at the hands of Napoleon I, the Prussians took the lesson of making war a science, a thing to be thought of and philosophized over in addition to waged. Prussian officers became educated technocrats, and a push for innovation in tactics and arms saw this small Germanic kingdom cast a large shadow over all of Europe. From the pages of von Clausewitz to the timetables of von Moltke, Prussia's rise was orchestrated by masterful generals and logisticians, united in one purpose: crush their enemies, elevate their kingdom, and never know the shame of defeat again.
This is so... it shows you just how... And this always makes me fear for America. Because, So nowadays, I think I can say America is the most powerful military in the world right now. But it shows you how over time, if I've learned a lot through this past year of looking at great history videos, thanks to you guys recommending. One of the big things I've learned is that nothing lasts forever, and at a certain point, your longevity as an empire or as a power becomes a disadvantage because the fire of different nations that aren't quite at your level is still burning very hot when yours is kind of complacent. And then you add the complacency of being so isolated and having not very powerful neighbors to the north and south in North and South America means that, yeah, we might be able to stave off any invasion for centuries, but at a certain point when an invasion is capable, I think it'll crush it. Or I don't know what I'm thinking. It just makes me think, realize how like no one stays the most powerful nation on the planet forever. It changes, and it often changes because someone else comes up with something that you didn't, partly because of their disadvantage. I hope that makes sense. Great video. Awesome. Let me know if I was wrong or stupid or smart. I love learning. This is an awesome channel. Hope you're all doing well. If not, don't worry. Emotions are fickle, my friend. You'll be good soon. All right. Till next time, guys. See you later.